Hello, Rob. How are you doing?
Hi. Well, actually, if I told you about the last 30 minutes, it would take too long, but I finally found a place where I can sit and give the lecture.
Oh,
I'm in Maroochydore in Queensland, and we landed late.
oh gosh.
And then I went to the apartment and they said, no, I couldn't check in until 2. So, but I found a place and I've got Wi-Fi and hopefully everything will go well. But if I speak too fast, it's because I'm overexcited.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you were able to, find a place and sort everything because with online talks, it's always like that, you're always worried about
I know.
and everything.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you so much. I would like to welcome you to the Wunderkammer program, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today. It's an absolute honor to have your talk as the grand finale, which marks the closing session of the Wunderkammer class. And although I'm sure everybody already knows you, but I'll do an introduction. Professor Rob Adams, sorry, has over 46 years of experience as a practicing designer in both private enterprise as well as public service. In 1985, Rob put into place the first comprehensive urban design strategy for the City of Melbourne and has since made a significant contribution to the rejuvenation of central Melbourne. Some key projects include Postcode 3000, CH2, which is Australia's first six-star green commercial office space, as well as Swanson Street, City Square, the return to Royal Park, the open space, and urban forest strategies. And also numerous community buildings, which include Docklands, Boyd, East Melbourne, and Kathleen Syme libraries. In 2007, Rob was awarded the Order for Australia for his contribution to architecture and urban design. And in 2008, the Prime Minister's Environmentalist of the Year. In 2018, Rob was the recipient of the Australian Institute of Architects National President's Award. Since 2000, his focus has been on how cities could be used to accommodate and mitigate rapid population growth and the onset of climate change. He has published and presented extensively on the subject. So thank you so much for coming today and speaking with us. And without further delay, I'd like you to take over, Rob.
All right. Okay, if you could go to the next one. So I wasn't born in Australia. I was actually born in Zimbabwe, on the land of the Zimbabwe people. So I've spent half my life in Zimbabwe and half my life in Australia. But since I've been in Australia, I've spent most of my time on the lands of the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples. And I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you. If I could go to the next one. So I'm going to talk in this one particularly about landscape and landscape in the Melbourne setting. And my first introduction to this was through the Royal Park competition, where when I came to the city, there was a competition for Royal Park, and the two people who presented that were Brian Stafford and Ron Jones, and they won the competition. And what I liked about it is they didn't put a lot of things into the space. In fact, they took things out of the space and they allowed the landscape to dominate. And you can see these beautiful drawings that they did as part of their submission. Next. And again here, these were typical of their drawings. And I was back there a few weeks ago, and if I could have the next slide. And the thing that dominated there was the sky. And you stand on the top of Royal Park and you see the sky. And if you go there today, and I'll have the next slide, you can see this mound where to the top right hand of the slide, and that was where they were doing their sketches. And if you stand on that, you do see the landscape dominating. We were lucky enough a few years ago when they moved the Children's Hospital to design the park in the bottom corner here, as you can see on Flemington Road, and you can see a very green mound. And just to the south of that was a park that we designed, which was an entrance to the park, but is also a children's playground. Next. And one of the things about this that we wanted to do is Royal Park is possibly one of the few places in Melbourne where you get some feeling of what the Indigenous landscape might be. And so we thought it was important when we came with this intervention into this park and we dealt with the Wurundjeri people, that we reflected the 7 Wurundjeri seasons, so that the landscape over the course of the year would change. And hopefully the people going to that park would notice these different seasons. So that's the way we laid out the landscape in and around the play equipment. Next. This gives you an idea of it today, and it's still a young park, it's still growing up. But all the plantings there reflect those that would have been found in this area and reflect those seasons. I think this is a very important thing to me, that I don't believe Melbourne has really looked closely at pre-settlement and what that means for this place. And I think we need to be mindful of that as we design. What was this place like? And how can we start to tell the stories of this place? Next. So I came to Melbourne and basically I was hired as an urban designer, and the role I was given was to one of 5 to help write the strategy plan in 1985. And next, what we did was the city was broke, and they didn't have a lot of money. They had an ambitious plan from 1975, which had never been implemented. And we were asked to write this plan. And one of the things that we mentioned to the councillors and eventually got into the plan is that we need to build on the characteristics of Melbourne. We can't, they were talking in 1975 about undergrounding the trams and some grand projects, all of which must have sounded nice at the time, but A, they didn't have the money, and B, that wasn't really a reflection of Melbourne. I mean, the trams are on the street and that's where you expect to find them. To design with that in mind. We produced this little document, Grids and Greenery, and what we looked at here was what were the characteristics of this place. So next. And they were made up of a number of elements. We have waterways, we have the combination of the Yarra that runs through the city. In that top left-hand side, we have the Maribyrnong. Many people don't think of the Maribyrnong as a Melbourne river, but it's actually a very important river in Melbourne. And then you have the Moonee Ponds Creek that comes down. You also had, if you go to the right, these fine boulevards that led out to certain areas. So, you know, Flemington Road leads you out towards the goldfields, etc. You know, Royal Parade sends you up to Sydney, and St Kilda Road down, you know, down the coast. And these were really important elements of the city, these boulevards. And below that one, the street grid, the city was a planned city. It was laid out. It wasn't a medieval city that had grown up over time. It was laid out and planned. And therefore, you had this gridded system that ran through the city, and that becomes part of its character. There also was this amazing network of parks, and I refer to it as the Emerald Necklace. I can hear someone eating, actually. It might be just nice to go on mute there. With the public open space. And what you had was this ring of metropolitan parks that go around the central city. As you can see on the bottom left hand. And this necklace of parks was an important element of Melbourne. So we looked at this and said, how do we reinforce these elements? Next. And you can see them here in more detail, and you recognize the names, Yarra Park, you know, Burnley Gardens, you know, Yarra Bend, etc. Some of them aren't parks. Some of them are the showgrounds and Flemington Racecourse. But I often wonder why they aren't parks, because they only have 12 race events at Flemington a year, and they have this huge area. And if you planted trees in the car park and you incorporate it with the showgrounds, you could have a magnificent park. And in fact, I lived near the showgrounds in Narari, and we thought of it as a park because that's exactly what they'd done. They'd planted trees. Next. So what I want to take you through is the elements that make good cities. So if you're going to build on the characteristics of a city, there's 5 things that you possibly need to do And then there are methods to do that through public participation, integrated action, adaptability. And if you do these things and you're successful in doing them, then what you will get is a city that's not both economically vital, socially cohesive, and sustainable. And so many of the things that we've done, I refer back to these characteristics. And I'll just walk you through very quickly how those characteristics were looked at in Melbourne and how we enhanced them. So the next one, which we'll talk about local character, is next. And the local character of Melbourne is made up in many ways. It's made up of materials we use, the character we actually put into it, the street furniture, and things like the lanes and arcades. Next. So the materiality was important. A lot of people don't know that, you know, in the early 1980s, there's very little bluestone paving in Melbourne. So one of the things we did immediately said, whenever you pave in Melbourne, you're going to pave in bluestone. At that stage, we had brick tiles, we had Italian imported tiles, we had tiles from all over the world. And if anybody cut through those paving, and then you came back to try and repair it, you could never find the same tiles. So it became a patchwork quilt. So we said, no, everything needs to be bluestone. And that was 1985. And the standards, how you'd lay the bluestone, etc. Next. And what you can see in the one that's coming up next, I think, is that's how much bluestone there was in central Melbourne, 1985, up by Parliament, a bit round Treasury, and down the bottom by a building put some bluestone paving. In fact, there was one other piece which I haven't got on this plan, which was in the city square. Next. And what we did is, as every development went through, we required that they pave the footpaths in bluestone. And you can see by 2014, most of the city was paved in bluestone. And that program continues today. I mean, if anybody was in Spring Street in the last few weeks, you would have seen that they were paving the footpaths up in Spring Street that hadn't been finished. And that has now become Melbourne's material. So that's part of our local character. That's part of the way we get an identity. Next. What that gave us is an excellent walking surface on which we could put things like sidewalk, cafes, public art. Next. And use the surface as one that was easy to change, but then put things on top. The second characteristic came out of the built form of Melbourne. So when Melbourne was set up, the blocks in Melbourne were 200 meters by 200 meters. Hoddle came through and he put the 10-meter streets through, as you can see here, and divided the 200 meters by 200 meters into 100 by 200 meters. These are big blocks. These are big blocks. If you want to walk around, you know, if you came in the middle, you have to go 100 meters one way or 100 meters the other. So what happened in the 19th century next was that people used to subdivide to, in fact, make money. So in subdividing, they took some of those big blocks and they divided them to a number of smaller blocks. And to gain access into those blocks, they created lanes and arcades. And that was part of what happened. And then we came here in the 1960s and next. You can see this is Collins Place at the top of the big you know, Y-shaped one at the top left-hand corner of that bottom slide. Was Collins Place. It's in Collins Street. It had one entrance, and the rest of the streets were fairly blank with entrances to car parks and air conditioning. And what we noticed there was people weren't recognizing that the lanes and arcades were really part of Melbourne's character, and they were introducing an international style here that internalized a lot of that and didn't give the streets energy. Next. And what you could see was streets like the one on the top were being turned into streets like the one in the middle. And that middle one is the back of Collins Place, or as it was in 1985. The bottom slide is as it is today. And we worked with them and we slowly convinced them to externalize and put the energy back in the street. So that means the lanes and arcades we saw as a very important characteristic in Melbourne. Next. And what happened is we worked on a program to slowly turn those lanes and arcades and small streets into pedestrian areas rather than vehicle areas. And this was not a difficult program. All we had to say was to people, we want to encourage you to trade onto the streets. So we gave them permits to trade onto the streets. We started to eliminate the cars from those streets, you know, during certain hours and sometimes completely. And that's become, people now talk about Melbourne's laneway culture. And it was built on something that already existed. Sydney have often come to us and said, we'd love to have a laneway culture. How do we do it? And the answer is, well, you haven't got any laneways of significance, so that's going to be difficult. So cities need to build on their own character, not that of other cities. Next. The other important thing was density and mixed use. And we knew back in 1985 that, in fact, the central city was called the Central Business District. And that's what it pretty much was. People came there, worked and then left. There was some entertainment, but if you came on a Saturday afternoon, it was deserted. And so we said, we need to get a residential population back. We need to increase the density downtown and make it into a mixed-use city. Next. The program that we put in place was called Postcode 3000. We wrote it into the 85 strategy plan. We said we need 8,000 dwellings in 15 years to come into the city. And we weren't sure how we were going to do that. And, I often say to people, you need to have an aspirational target. You'll work out how to get there once you've convinced yourself that the target's right. And that was our aspirational target, 8,000 in 15 years. What happened in the late 1980s is we had a property market crash and they overbuilt the commercial office buildings. And people moved out of all the secondary stock into the primary stock, and we had empty office buildings. So we then put in place this postcode 3000, and that saw a rapid increase in the population. Next. Back in 1982, we had 685 dwellings in the central city. So each one of those red dots is 5 dwellings. Next. And when the program took off, you can see by 2002, we had 13,000. Next. And by 2016, we had 41,000. We've now got over 46,000 residential units in the central city. And this completely changed the central city. It made it a mixed-use city. And what happened on the back of that, next, is that we got an increase in, I'll lead to this. We'll come to it. We got an increase in hospitality and retail. But with a population like that, with a rapid population like that, what you got was a need for more open space. And a lot of people don't realize that central Melbourne, although we've got this ring of beautiful parks that surround it, it was never designed with too many public spaces or small open spaces. In fact, it was designed without those. It was thought that there'd be collecting points for people, maybe from the mines that would object, and therefore they were not there. We had 5 markets, but we didn't have at City Square, for instance. So the challenge, and I had parks and gardens in my portfolio for about 8 years. And when we did an open space strategy, we found if we wanted to provide the open space for this central city, we would have to spend $700 million on buying land. Now, we didn't have 700 million. So what we started in 1985 was a program I call Greater Green. And this is stealing space away from the car and giving it to pedestrians in open space. And you can see the left-hand slide. You can see in the top of the slide, Neil Street, as it is car dominated. We closed that street and then designed in this active park that runs through the middle of the high density suburbs there. The bottom of Errol Street in North Melbourne, the tiny slide in the middle, there was a 500 square meter roundabout. And all we did was take away the two-way movement around that. And we took 500 meters and turned it into 5,000 meters. That saved us 14 million in land purchase price, and we created a local park. And over the 30 years, we've taken 80 hectares of asphalt and other infrastructure out of the central city and turned it into widened footpaths and green space. Next. These are many of the programs, and you can see it starts back in, in a very modest way in the late 1980s and runs right through to today. I don't expect you to read this. The presentation is with you, and you'll get this, and you'll be able to read it in your own time. But what I'm trying to show is we were doing incremental action over a long period of time. And the importance of that is if you say to a population, we're going to close all your streets and we're going to turn it to open space, there'll be a pushback. But if you slowly just widen footpaths and take away roads incrementally over a long period, you get the success that we've had in Melbourne, where we've got 80 hectares of new space for people. And we've got a better balance. This isn't about eliminating the car. This is about getting a better balance between the car and the pedestrian. Next. And they fall into many different types of projects, and there's some illustrated here, and I won't take you around them, but it includes putting medians down the center of roads, taking out slip lanes, etc., widening footpaths. So there were a number of ways that we gained the space back. Next. The next thing that's important to a city is a high quality public realm. And if you ask me, what is the public realm? It's all the area outside of any building. So it's the space between buildings. And too often that space is disregarded. You look at many of the new settlements, buildings are stuck in the middle of the site and the space is leftover space rather than designed and programmed space. So a high quality public realm is really important. And we just started, as with the bluestone paving, to plant trees, etc. Next. If you take this single phrase away from this talk this afternoon, I would be pleased, because if you think of the public space outside of buildings, 80% of that is made up of roads or streets. And therefore, if the street is of a high quality, if it's a street you want to walk down, if it's a street that's got activity in it, a street that's lined by buildings that interact with that street, then you're going to get, it's no more difficult than that. In fact, I often wonder why we make it so difficult, because we just should start looking at the streets and say, how would we make the street better? And if you do the other things that we're talking about, mixed use and density, you'll start to pull a good city together. So that was a bit of a mandate that I've been working to for the last 38 years. Next. And, here we talked about this earlier, decent footpaths that you could walk on. And next, this allowed us on the footpaths to, take away some of that footpath and increase it. So Lygon Street was one of the first ones we did, where we widened the footpaths and we planted trees down the middle. Next. And so we got both the side trees and we got the median trees. So if you go down Lygon Street today, it's a treed street. It's got all the activity, which has now been able to accommodate it on the footpath. And it's an interesting street that people like to go to. Some people have become a bit complacent to trade there, and it's not always the quality experience that you'd want. But in fact, it's an interesting experience, and I think it'll be resilient enough to fight back. Next. The other simple thing we did, top left-hand slide, is there was parking. This is the Little Streets. This is Little Collins Street, in fact. And we took parking off one side, and as you can see in the slide below, we then widened the footpaths, and you can see in the top slide they had sandwich boards. So if someone with a pram had to try and walk down that street, it was not an easy thing to do. So we widened the footpath on the sunny side. We took away the sandwich boards, because we said if people can't actually attract people into their shops by the way they operate, they shouldn't be allowed to clutter up the public realm. And what happened out of that is, because the streets became more pleasant to use, people started coming back and shopping and staying in cafes. Next. And we put medians down the street. So if you go through Carlton and many of those very wide streets, we just dug up the middle, which was the easiest place to dig because there are no services out in the middle. And we just created these medians and planted trees. And this is my little family on the right-hand side. It was interesting during COVID that if we wanted to get out, Edinburgh Gardens is close to where we live, but it was too crowded. We could go across to a median there and sit and have a picnic in the median like many other people. And it just provided a respite in the city. And not only that, because it's soft and it's got grass, it allows water into the ground, which helps us with the groundwater and therefore the survival of our trees. Next. So wherever we could, we dug up the middles of roads and we planted trees. Next. And this is Neil Street that I showed you before, and you can see the street in the distance and Neil Street running through. Next. And the other distinctive thing that we started to do was to give facilities for people on the streets. So, places to buy a newspaper. Next. Or places to sit. And that curved sitting rail you're seeing there has two purposes. One, it gives people a place to rest their back against it. But it also, we found skateboarders jumping over there, and it stops the skateboarders from jumping over, because people sitting quietly and skateboarding sometimes doesn't go together. So we're not anti-skateboarders, but we'd like them to go to certain places and for people to be able to sit quietly in other spaces. And we're worried about the detail. I put this little handrail in because a lot of our furniture just thought about the small detailed things. And we found if you detail things well and design them well, you get less vandalism. And that's been the case with a lot of the installations we've done. Next. And this is a chair outside RMIT, which I'm sure you've all seen, which is part of a range of our furniture. Next. We also, and I had arts and culture in my portfolio as well, and we also put in place a strategy of putting art into laneways. And this was in 2006, and these were temporary installations that went into the laneways. And the reason behind that was to attract people into the laneways so they could discover them, and then discover how their scale and their interest was quite exciting. And so this was using art as a way of encouraging people to use the lanes and arcades. Next. But then we had a secret weapon, and the secret weapon was coffee. If we widened the footpaths and planted trees, we then thought we wanted people to come back and use the footpaths. And we were told that people in Melbourne wouldn't sit on the footpaths, it was too cold and wet. So we tested that. And if you go to the next one, when we started, there were just two cafes in Melbourne. And we started to put facilities like this on the street, coffee bars, the floral stand, you could buy where you could buy a newspaper, and even fruit stalls. Next. And as I said, there were two back in the 1980s, and the arrows show them here in case you missed them. Next, and this shows what happened over that period. By the time we got to 2014, we had 534 sidewalk cafes. And during COVID, of course, people weren't allowed inside. We had a program to increase the sidewalk cafes. And we got over 800 applications. Not all of them happened, but we got a huge number, and some of those have gone in. Next. The other simple thing to do in a city is just to plant trees. If it's all you can afford, the planting of a tree changes the feel of the city. You can see, take the middle set here, 1992, 2005 with Swanson Street. Swanson Street's not a beautiful street. The architecture doesn't leave much to be desired, particularly on the southern end. Once you get up towards RMIT, it starts to get more exciting. But you plant some trees, and suddenly you get this coherence of the street, the unification of it. And the architecture becomes slightly better because you see it on a glimpse, you don't see it in full face, frontal. And of course, the trees help cool the city. So we went on a program of planting trees. Next. And this gives you some indication of the trees we planted in the central city. So a lot of people, I think, again, like the Bluestone, accept that the city always had trees. No, it didn't. In fact, there were trees in some of the streets, but in fact, it wasn't part of the program. And we put in a lot of trees over that period. Next. And it starts to show in the way that the city feels. Our projects have become more ambitious. I mean, we started Grey to Green by planting 10 trees and widening a footpath by a metre in South Yarra. We're now taking half of South Bank Boulevard, mainly because when the Commonwealth Games came in 2006, we closed the end of South Bank Boulevard at Queensbridge Square, and that dropped the number of cars from 30,000 a day to 15,000 a day. So with half the cars, we said, well, you only need half the area. Next. And we started to put in place a plan to take away half of the area and turn it into a linear park for two reasons. One, to give that space back to the people, but also South Bank has very little open space for the local people down there. And so the colored pieces here, the orange and green, you can see our projects are being done at the moment. The blue is on hold a little bit because there's a big building going up on the corner, but the orange and green will be finished within about 18 months. And next. Parts of those have been completed already. So these are the streets down there. You can see very wide. Next. And what we're proposing in those streets is that they will become, linear parks. Each one of those pieces of linear park is about the size of the city square. So they're not inconsiderable in their size. Next. And this is the piece we finished outside the Melbourne Theatre Company. This is more hard paved because we had the cafes and restaurants there. And as we go down the street, it becomes greener. Next. We even planted in the middle in the tram line so that we could get water penetration down into the earth. One of the biggest problems, and I'll come to it in a second, is water. Water is the new gold in Australia. Next. Here you can see the impact of planting trees. Swanson Street was closed in 1992. So, 29 years ago. And at the time, people worried about a view down the middle of the street. Well, the trees are almost joining in the middle of those street of the street at the moment. But it's completely changed this feeling of Melbourne as a green city. Next. And many of our actions are small. So this shows a lot of what we've done. I mean, the bottom left, right hand, we cut a hole in the town hall that used to be a window, and we created an information centre. We paved the streets in bluestone, widened the footpaths, put a flower cellar on the corner, and then designed this little cafe that's elevated from the street. And we turned something that was a very ordinary space. It used to have an open space, but it had nothing in it and nowhere to buy coffee, and there were just pigeons. And we've slowly created a place where we think people like to stay. Next. And so we've gone around the city and we've looked at opportunities. This was a traffic island at the top of Little Bourke Street. So we celebrated our Chinese community and the fact that they were, some of the first people, post-colonial settlers of Melbourne. And so this is a celebration and turning a traffic island into a meeting place and a place to sit. Next. And we took the city square, which had been designed and won some architectural awards. It was opened by the Queen, but it failed. And it failed because public spaces only succeed if you have activities around the edges. So if you think of any good public space that you'd like to go to, it'll usually be what happens around the edges that makes that an exciting space. Quite often, the space itself is very simple. It might just be paved. It might just have a fountain in the middle. So this is not about putting stuff into space. This is about putting activity around space. So we took the city square and we went to the bottom of the water wall and we sold off the back part. Next. And we used that money to build a car park below the city square and to make a smaller city square, but with cafes and restaurants around it. Next. And we gave people places to sit. So people started to come back to this place. Quite often I say, if you're designing public space, it's better to make a small space than a big space. A small space, you only need a few people to make it feel busy. If you design a huge space, you're going to need a football crowd to make it feel busy. And if you think, for those of you who might have been to Sydney, you think of Darling Harbour, it never quite feels full because the spaces are huge. So having intimate small spaces is always a better solution to a city and its spaces. Next. And as we talk to you at the moment, we've got about 10 of these spaces coming through the system. I've spoken to you about South Bank Boulevard. Market Street opened while you were locked down in COVID. And if you go up off Collins Street by the Pant Scraper, you'll see this new park that runs down to Flinders Lane. And there are a whole lot of others that we've gone through, which I haven't got time to talk to you today. Next. So we've talked about a high quality public realm and what achieves that. The next is connectivity. If you want a city to work, you need to be able to walk through it, ride through it, drive through it, and use public transport. And it needs to be convenient, and you don't need any barriers. So next. So we went on a program of trying to get the best public transport system we can get. And it's not a responsibility of ours, it's a state government responsibility. But we were certainly responsible for the pedestrians and the bikes. And so we started to give them more space. Next. And Swanson Street, when we closed it, which was an action we put in the 85 strategy plan, we closed in 92. And it was the main street through Melbourne. It used to take 60,000 cars a day. but it was a terrible street. I mean, a lot of people talk about it romantically as though it was a great street, but if we go to the next, street on the left is Swanson Street. So it had narrow footpaths, they were asphalted, there were cars down the whole lot. Many of the properties were, in fact, vacant and up for lease. So the retail core of Melbourne was dying. By widening the footpaths, planting trees and putting sculpture in, we managed to get people back. And I think a lot of the traders at the time didn't believe us. Next. But you can see from these figures, back in 1993, which is when we finished, we started construction in 92, finished in 93, we had 12,800 pedestrians a day between 10 in the morning and 6 in the evening. And you can see the subsequent rise in this. Today, we've got over 65,000. Well, not today, but just pre-COVID. We had 65,000 people walking and using Swanson Street. Next. It had become one of the busiest streets in Melbourne. In fact, we were starting to remove some of the things we'd put in earlier on to provide amenity on the street. And what we did also is, you can see here, we provided good facilities for public transport, so you could get onto public transport with some dignity rather than standing in the road and being sprayed by a car that might be passing you. Next. And here's the street. This is obviously pre-COVID and pre the start of Metro, because the City Square, as you know, is now dug up and is going to come back, post-Metro. But the street is a vibrant place and a central pedestrian artery for our city. Next. The other thing, as I mentioned, I had responsibility for parks and gardens, and it happened to be around about the turn of the century. Next. And what was happening is we had the Millennium Drought. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that meant. But first of all, what we wanted to do back in 1985 was to extend the open space. So in this slide, in the middle, just as the river turns at the top there, you can see two big tower buildings. They were the gas and fuel buildings, and they sat where Federation Square is today, in front of the cathedral. And we aspirationally did a drawing. Next. And the drawing we did, you can see the 1986, was this one where we showed this is what we'd like to be, where we'd like to be in 2000. We'd like to, in fact, extend the park on the east of the city right the way around and have it uninterrupted by the rail lines. So people would get this feeling from Carlton Gardens right down to the bay through, Albert Park and Faulkner Park. You get this linear green wedge. Next. So with Federation Square, which we partnered with the state government, we went to the Premier of the day, Jeff Kennett, and said, look, on the back of Fed Square, there are 12 running lanes that run through the station. The other, and there were 56 lines there, the others were where they stored trains at night. And we said, you remove the trains and put them at the end of the line where you can store them, and we will design and build a park. And to his great credit, he said yes, and that's what he did. And we designed and built Birrarung Mall. And that started to go towards this vision of bringing the parks right around that eastern edge of the city. And this was a park that was designed to take events, because many of the events were happening in our green parks, and they were suffering as a result. Next. Oh, I just showed this because in that park, if you stop and walk through carefully, you'll find a lot of references to the First Nations and the Aboriginal people. In fact, this is an eel, and there are two eels that intertwine over the path that goes through that. And this was made and cast over a fairly laborious process where we worked with a number of the Aboriginal artists to do this project. Next. One of the things that we were realizing at the turn of the century was, although we were getting these horrific fires, and you get 173 people died in 2009 in the bushfires then, more people were dying just because of heat. And you can see 374 died in the same year just from the heat wave. And we started to realize with climate change that heat was going to be a problem, particularly in the central city. Next. The heat island effect of a city is considerable. And some of the plantings we had on the left-hand side, we put in a meadow in Birrarung Mall. And we realized that, in fact, while the meadow was beautiful, it required a lot of water, and it only lasted a couple of years. Next to it, we started to look at woody meadows. These are meadows that last a long time, need low water, but also equally beautiful. Beautiful in a different way, more subtle in their floral display, but more intricate in their leaf structures, etc. So this was about, a new way of looking at the landscape in Melbourne. Next. And this shows you what the woody meadow looks like. So you have plants that are low, plants that are medium height, and then some of them, emergent layers that get up to a couple of meters. So this was we did with the University of Melbourne and University of Sheffield. Next. The other realization we had, and this was one that I find quite emotional, because when I came and settled in Melbourne, I was in Paran, and I basically lived in Paran, and I used to drive my children through Faulkner Park, which is right down the bottom there. And I went through Faulkner Park, and most of the trees were dying. And we did a survey of all the trees, and it looked like we were going to lose 48% of our trees in 20 years. So we decided we needed to do something about it. Next. And the reason we were losing a lot of our trees were, some of them were all of the same species. Also, our gardens were quite old, so the tree stock was quite old. But if you look at the sixth line there, periods of drought, you can see the big one in 2000 is this big piece of brown. And what we had referred to as droughts were no longer droughts. This was the onset of climate change. We were starting to get climate change coming through, and we were still calling it a drought. And the realization to us is we needed to change. Next. And so we put in place an urban forest strategy, and we also had an open space strategy, which I've spoken to you a bit about. And the urban forest strategy was saying, how do we increase the canopy cover of the city? Next. And we started a strategy, and I said to my team, this was the problem. If you look at this, this is taken at midnight. The streets are hot. Wherever there's asphalt, it's hot. And you can see the gardens are blue and yellow, which is much better. Next. Some of those big blue spots happen to be air-conditioned sheds, which is not a good idea. But we realized that if you plant trees, you can actually lower the temperature by 4 degrees centigrade. And so we started to look at where can we plant trees and what trees do we want to plant next. And so we put in place this urban forest strategy. And I said to my team, I don't want you talking about the types of trees, because we get into an argument about indigenous and exotic and all the rest of it. And that's not a healthy argument. What I want people to think about is, how much canopy cover do we need? We need to go from 22% to 40%. We need diversity of species, because we're not sure what pests are going to come or what trees will survive in the heat. We need to improve the health of our vegetation, and we need soil moisture. So those were the strategies we put in place, the 6 there, and they were adopted, because I think everybody would agree more trees was going to be better, and if this is what it meant, everybody voted for it. And so we got the strategy through. And then we could start talking to people about what sort of trees and where to plant next. And we used a process here where we created, and I hope I don't get this wrong, I think it was actually with people from RMIT, we created this app called the Urban Forest. And if you look up Urban Forest Melbourne on your phone or your iPad, and you can get every tree that's planted in Melbourne. And if you're walking past one, you can click on it and it'll tell you its genus, and it'll tell you how its life expectancy and all the rest of it. It also has an email address. Next. And what happened is, people noticing the email address started to talk to the trees. And we got these messages coming through that you can see on the left-hand side. And it might have been a career limiting experience, but I said to my people, you can respond to those. And we started to answer them. And we got a dialogue going with the community, and people started to realize how important trees were. And this just went viral. It went around the world. In fact, Bloomberg, took this program up, and I was invited to the UK when he had a big conference there. And the sole exhibit he had in the foyer was Melbourne's urban forest strategy. That's how passionately he felt about it. So this was a way of communicating using social media and other media to get a wider coverage with the population. Next. And the other problem we had, so the last one is about participation. This is about integrated action. If we're going to solve a problem, we all need to be pulling in the same direction. And the other problem we needed to solve was water. You can see how the water rainfall was dropping off in Melbourne, and we were getting less water. We were getting sometimes coming in larger falls and not spread more evenly. Next. So what we started to do was collect water. This is the runoff from East Brunswick that comes into Royal Park, and we collect it in a wetland, which you can see on the left-hand side there, and we store it in a storage dam on the right. And we reuse it back in the gardens for watering the gardens. Next. And so we had a whole program of getting water. We put medians down the middle of the streets. So all these blue lines were in fact wide grass medians. So when rain fell, it actually fell on grass and penetrated the earth, and we got moisture levels in the earth. The cheapest place to store moisture is in the ground. And so rather than build a whole lot of tanks, we thought we'd just get permeability. Excuse me. The stars you can see there were some water tanks we built, and we built, you can see some of them are up the top, and those are up in Carlton. The reason we built them up there is you can see the contours flowing down to the Yarra River. And so when you got a heavy storm, all the water rushed down into Elizabeth Street, and we're getting flooding the bottom of Elizabeth Street. So we built these big tanks, and what we did is we captured the water on the way. We slowed down the overland flow, but we also got to use the water. Next. There were other very simple things, as you can see on the right hand here. The drainage pits on the street, we took into a tree pit, and the tree was set below ground. So the water came into the tree pit, gave the tree a good water, got down into the soil, and if there was too much water, of course, it would get into the pipe. But we wanted to get into the pipe last. We wanted to get into the soil first and around the trees. So we started to put our trees in these pits so that the water goes into the tree pits. Next. And this was the tank in Fitzroy Gardens. So I was lucky when I had parks and gardens. If you went into Fitzroy Gardens, which is one of our most historic parks, and said you were going to dig a big tank, you wouldn't get very far. Next. So what we did is we decided, and it was a big tank. You can see the people in here, very small at the back there. It was 5 million litres. Next. And what we did is we took the depot. You can see the depot on the left there. It was a hodgepodge of buildings that had grown up over many decades and wasn't very efficient. So we removed a lot of those buildings and we rationalized it, and we made the depot much smaller. And then what we did is we built the tank under the, if you go to the right-hand image, under that green lined lawn there is the 5 million litre tank. And just to the bottom left-hand corner is the rain garden that purifies the water. And to its edge, you've got a pavilion where you can buy a coffee, which works with Cook's Cottage. So in this single project, we looked after the tourist industry, we collected water and slowed down the flooding, we reused the water in the park, but we got an extra 4,000 square meters of open space. And that was what made us able to sell it. We got money from both the feds and the state by just having a project we said would be beneficial to the majority of the people in Melbourne. Next. And that project today, if you go there, this is the little pavilion, and you can see some of the plantings are more water resistant than you would normally find. And we've got this green wall that runs around the cafe. So it disappears back with the depot and it becomes recessive in these beautiful gardens. Next. We also put water tanks under streets. So this is Darling Street in East Melbourne. Next. And we built tanks under the road, and then we built rain gardens in the medians in the middle of the road, as you can see here. So we collected the water as it came down the hill, purified it, put it in the tanks, and then used it back in the gardens. Next. And this was a process that was very successful in keeping gardens. With COVID, we looked at this, and really, with COVID, we need to respond, recover, and then move forward, regenerate. And so we had a series of projects that try to build on what we're already doing. Next. And I won't run through them, but there were 40 kilometers of new bike lanes going, and you would have seen them. There was support for cafes and restaurants. There was support for businesses. There was support for university students, where we gave them money to go and spend on food at Queen Victoria Market. There was a whole program response to try and keep people able to get through COVID, but also, still use the city. Next. And this is a map that shows the projects we had, and I won't go through all of it, but the green lines are the bike paths. Next. and you'll see the bike path going up Exhibition Street at the moment. And then there was art that we're putting into the street at the moment, and a whole lot of other programs. And when you get these slides, you'll be able to look at those more closely. Next. And we allowed people to widen the footpath. So this was up at the top of Burke Street. Next. And what they did is they took away the car parking spaces, or we took away the car parking space, and we allowed them to expand the footpath and use it. And that meant they could actually keep a decent number of customers and support them from their kitchen, while they were going through that difficult period where people weren't allowed inside in restaurants. Next. I want to end. How am I going on time? Is this all right? I'll be another 5 or 10 minutes. Okay. I want to talk about the bigger city. I want to talk about the metro city, and what I want to tell you, and I'm telling you the punchline, is that we can double the population of Metro Melbourne without taking away any more agricultural land. We can do it on 7.5% of the city. We don't have to build higher than 5 to 8 stories, and we build in and around our transport infrastructure. And if we do that, we will save 550 billion in infrastructure costs over 50 years. Why is that important? Let me tell you very quickly. Next. So what happens at the moment is whenever there's a need for more housing, the government's put it on the fringe, and all those blue hatched areas you can see were areas that were taken and converted into greenfield sites. The problem with that, next, is that if you put people far out, they are disadvantaged. And this was a study done by Griffith University. You can see from 2001 to 2006 how, if red and orange is people suffering difficulty through mortgage prices and petrol prices, you can see the increase in the orange and yellow. This meant that more people were having much harder experiences with their budgets than those people in the inner city who were close to all the facilities they needed. Next. And what you saw was some of the symptoms. And if you could just flick through the next few quite quickly, the city was less walkable. When you got, hold on that one, when you got some, family violence, something that we talk about. And that the government's putting more money into family violence, but at the same time saying, let's expand the city. And where is that family violence predominant? On those fringes. It's not, totally the only reason, but you can understand if people have the stress of, extra costs for owning 2 cars and, having to drive every time they wanted to get somewhere. That could lead to frustration that results in things like family violence. Next. There's also a problem with obesity, that, if you're sitting in a car for an hour and a half getting to work and getting back, you might be snacking and you're not walking. So RMIT have done a study, they've actually shown that you're more likely to have a heart attack if you live in the suburbs than if you live in the central city. Why? Because if you're in the central city, you walk more. In fact, you walk for possibly 41 minutes a day, whereas if you live in the suburbs, you must be walking for 7 minutes a day as part of your commute. Next. So what we looked at is we said, well, what if? What if you put your population in and around the existing activity centres, where there's a railway station? This is Box Hill. And we went around the city, and 3% of the metro area is made up of activity centres. Next. And we found you could put 860,000 people there. And there are a lot of activity centres, as you can see from this diagram here. Next. The second one we said is, then let's put them along all the road-based public transport, the tram routes and the rapid bus routes. And you can look at that aerial photograph and you can see the built form adjacent to that corridor, which happens to be Sydney Road, is a different built form to immediately behind it, which happens to be residential. And what we were saying is, stay out of the residential, but build your density in and around these corridors where you want to get people onto public transport. Next. And what we saw is you had a fantastic tram system and you had this gridded road system with buses on. So in fact, it was the ideal system for a good public transport system that could connect with railway stations and take people, not only into the city, but around it. Next. And with new technology, this is the Trackless Tram, which is emerging now from China. and it looks like a tram, and it carries the same capacity of the tram. It's got no overhead wires, and it's got no tracks. It's guided along those white lines, by a computer, and it's got batteries and it's electric, so you don't need the overhead wires. It comes at 1/10 of the cost of light rail. So there are systems now which will allow us to expand these systems, and we know that if you build those systems, that development comes to those areas. Next. So we went through a study and looked at every parcel of land, and there were 1.5 million parcels of land. Next. And we took out all the sensitivities. I haven't shown you that because we'd go on for too long, but we looked at every site and we took out things like heritage and whether they were built recently and all the rest of it. And what we came to a conclusion is you can put 2.4 million people along those, 2.4 along the bus lines and 1 million along the tram line. So you're getting nearly 3 million people, in that sort of area. So, there's a reason why you would do that. Next. And this is one of the examples. So you can see the city in the far distance. This is Nicholson Street. You can see the expensive infrastructure and look at the development alongside. So next, we said, what if you put 5 to 8 stories of development just along the street, not further back, but just along the street. Next. And this has started to be built. And this is a good example of what you can build. And what you're getting here is activities at the ground floor, people living above. That population not only makes the public transport system more viable, but it provides employment and energy within those high streets. Next. So this is the model. And if you just flick through this, basically along the tram lines, we said, put your development along the tram lines. Next. Don't put it in the middle. Next. So leave the suburbs as they are, so you don't have to build in those. And in the suburbs, that's where you plant your trees, collect water, put solar panels on your roof. Next. And what that gives you is the new green wedge. That's where you can walk out of suburbia to a high street, to a denser population, and live what I think people wanted to do in the suburbs is, live in a pleasant environment, but be able to get to the things they need and make a walkable city. Next. So, as I said, we have advocated back in 2010 that you could do this without expanding the city. Unfortunately, the state government is still expanding the city, but not at greater rate as they were previously. Next. That's the end of the talk. And I know I've gone a bit long. That interesting. Okay.
Thank you, Rob. I stopped sharing the screen, but if you would like me to, I can always pull it back again.
No.
I think it was fantastic, and thank you so much. And first of all, actually, I should thank you for making the city of Melbourne what it is today. I am new to Melbourne and I'm still exploring it, but I think that one image where you showed, I think it was Little Collins Street, where in 1992 it was all hard paved, and then in 2000 and I suppose 8, all of a sudden there were trees in it. I mean, it was such a contrast, but I think it seemingly a small change, a small intervention, so to say, of adding a tree or adding trees, but I think it just changes the way the streets work. It changes the way the city works, and I think it makes such a big difference in how people actually interact with the city. So I think it's absolutely fantastic to see what the thought behind that would have been, and how it completely transforms the way the city functions, so to say. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. If anybody has any questions for Rob, please go ahead and turn on your cameras and feel free to ask Rob. Are there any questions from the students or any comments?
Rob, I had a question. I was just wondering, what do you think is maybe the most challenging part of all these plans?
I think the most important thing, Toby, I don't know whether it's challenging, but certainly the most important is we need to have politicians that can set a vision of the city they want. And the challenge becomes one that I've worked at the City of Melbourne now for 38 years. So what you're seeing is 38 years of incremental work. And that's why I suppose it looks impressive, because you take 38 years and compact into a 40-minute talk, and it looks okay. But the reality is cities change very slowly, and they change through incremental action. Every good development makes that city better. Every bad development makes it worse. But politicians come in for 3 or 4 years. And the thing that I find most challenging is to stop them going for the sugar hits. The small things that cost quite a bit of money, but won't be lasting. And that's why I start with this message that, find out what's good about your city and be prepared to build that slowly over time. That'd be far better than coming up with, a very expensive project that, maybe would work in some other city, but might not work as well in your city. And I think that's the thing that I find challenging. And in a way, the politicians we had back in the early 80s were really good. They understood that. And because they put in place the vision, and the vision started to work while they were in office, people have stuck with it over that 38 years. So I think that's the difficult thing, to convince people that their actions might need to be incremental, and they might not see the full benefit in their term, but the city will improve over time. You asked me what the biggest challenge today is. Climate change, of course. And the thing is, and you guys know these stats, I mean, over 50% of the world's living in cities at the moment. And we drive 75% of the GDP of the world. So if you can make the city sustainable, you start to get halfway towards solving the climate crisis. And why do I tell you that? Because I've been lucky enough to go to the World Economic Forum since 2008, and I sort of represent Australia there on the cities program. And when I went there, they've got all these councils, and they had a council on climate change, and all they were doing was telling us the problem. Climate change is bad. Yes, yes, yes. And I don't disagree with any of that. It is. But I said to them, maybe if you ask the question in a different way, maybe if you ask the question, what do we do about climate change in our cities, as opposed to just climate change, then people stop and think, okay, what would you do in the city? You'd plant trees, you'd have an urban forest strategy, you'd collect water, you'd have a city as a catchment strategy. You mostly look at greening up the commercial buildings. So, we built CH2 in 2006, which was a 6-star Green Star commercial building, the first in Australia. And it was about getting people to focus on what we all can do, rather than just leaving it as a government responsibility. And I think that's the thing that, as frustrated as I get with governments who are about to spend money on gas-fired power stations, I then look at everybody putting solar panels on their houses, and finance companies starting to say they won't finance redundant infrastructure that's going to be stranded in 15, 20 years' time. So in the end, I think that collective action will be the thing that actually helps us. Because right at the moment, there are not too many politicians around the world running countries that are good at climate change. It's a pleasure to see Biden come in and change, and Boris Johnson moving in the right direction. But certainly, our federal government is, really not very inspiring on that at all.
Right. So it's really a matter of sort of getting people to not approach it from a short-sighted angle, and sort of getting them thinking about the solution instead of the problem.
Sure. I mean, the next time I hear someone say, as I think Morrison said yesterday, that windmills don't always turn and the sun doesn't always shine, it's as though he's never heard about a battery. And you just think, you can collect that energy and store it in batteries, and you could make the batteries. They don't have to be big like the ones that we've built in Victoria and South Australia. You could put smaller scale batteries in residential areas in, smaller areas, so that you don't have to transport that, energy a long way. You take it off the roof, stick it in a localized battery. Well, it'd have to be of a reasonable size. And then that area can be supported, if it needs it. So, yeah, I just don't think we're thinking, broadly or wisely enough on the subject at the moment.
That's, yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. I think the other thing, while other people are asking questions, I've mentioned it a few times. What I didn't show you there, and the reason I went to, the study on the metro area, is I was educated at, I'd lived in Zimbabwe, but they didn't have an architectural faculty at their university. So I went to Cape Town University, and Cape Town University is stuck on the side of Table Mountain. And in 1969, and as a fourth-year student, I travelled around Europe, and all the baby boomers had come to the universities, and all the universities in Europe were expanding. So I spent a good time on my year out looking at universities and their architecture and noticing, how they were expanding. I got back to Cape Town, and they're surrounded by a national park. They can't expand. And I said to the planners there, so what are you doing? And they said, oh, we've just asked a different question. The question we've asked is, how well are we using the stuff we've built? And they found lecture theatres were being used for 17.5% of the day. So they said, we're just going to re-timetable. I went back 40 years later. They trebled the student numbers on that campus, and they hadn't built anything. And suddenly the penny dropped. Why couldn't we do that to cities? Why couldn't we build it on the existing infrastructure? And hence that thing about building around, railway stations and long tram lines, because you've built that infrastructure, and much of it is underutilized. Might be utilized heavily for a few hours in the day. But if you start to re-timetable, and COVID's taught us something, we don't all have to turn up to work at 8 o'clock. You could actually use the existing infrastructure far more efficiently. So think about that. Think about adaptation. How do you adapt a city rather than think we've got to build it from scratch? I seem to have spent my whole career adapting things. And I only realized that when I started to think about it a few months ago, and I was looking back on my career, and it started to dawn on me. That's all I've done. I've adapted old buildings from offices into residential, adapted streets into open space and wider footpaths, taken railway lines away and created Burra and Ma. It's just a process of adaptation. And that is, I think, quite an important lesson for cities to learn, because most of our cities are already there. So if we're going to improve them, we're going to have to adapt them.
Rob, I had a question regarding, all the designs that have been done obviously have a very, very sort of long timeline in the sense that it would, start probably at, let's say in 2010, and it'll, by the time the design gets completed, it would be another 10 years. And by the time you actually start seeing the results of the design, it would be probably another 20 to 30 years. So in such scenarios, is it very difficult? I mean, when you start off putting things into plan and putting, getting things signed off and all of that, like when the design process starts to when it actually ends, there's obviously a lot of speculation that goes on. So how does one go about, putting thought into action really without actually knowing what the end result would be? It's obviously with projects like these would be, got long timelines, so it's
Sure.
to have I mean,
I'd like to tell you that we planned the way we did it, but we didn't. But what happened is back in 1985 with the strategy plan, because we didn't have much money, we started to do a lot of the small things like designing a range of furniture, planting trees, putting bluestone paving in. So, and then we built up. And in 1992, so this is, 7 years after the strategy was in place, there was enough momentum from all those small things that people had confidence to allow us to do some of the bigger projects. So in 1992, Swanson Street closed. Postcode 3000 started. The South Bank of the Yarra, the state government fixed up and put South Bank in place there. all of those things start to happen. And then there starts to get this sort of critical mass. And because at any one stage, we would have about 200 projects running, the politicians were happy that, maybe 50 of those reached completion in each year. And the longer ones just took much longer. I mean, I've been working on, I think, Queen Victoria Market since I started the council. And, it's only now that we're starting to get some traction with what needs to happen up there. And some projects are more difficult than others. I think Queen Victoria Market's been the hardest because, I mean, there's a lot of people who say, we don't want Queen Victoria Market to change. And then you ask them when they were last there, and many of them haven't been there for years. So people have an emotional attachment to something and don't realize that it's dying. And it's almost dying, through, the overlove that it's getting and the realization that, trading has to change. You have to give the traders facilities like water and, easy ways to get rid of their organic waste and all those things that will make their business more viable without changing the nature of market. And so, some projects just take time. And that's where you rely on the patience and the goodwill of the politicians to support those projects. But every year, you're delivering a whole host of smaller projects. So that, there are celebrations and tape cuttings of all of those. So it's a combination of keeping things coming through and not just betting on the big projects because they do take much longer.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. And I also have
Is there no more? Yeah, okay.
In regards to that, considering our course focuses on rewilding, we're also trying to look at how we can design for other species, so to say, not just human-centered design, but design which could,
Sure.
for example, you spoke about, starting with native species of plants, but also looking at how we can facilitate design for, let's say, animals. So when you talk about the urban forest strategy, has that been one of the concerns with the design?
Well, there are a whole lot of other strategies come with that. There's strategies to look at, underplanting, particularly in places like, Royal Park and, wherever we can, so that you can get some low planting and therefore increase the biodiversity in those. We're also looking at links. So we're trying to get links between different areas. So you get corridors that allow, animals to sort of move through those corridors. So the program is far wider than the brief one I've given you. And I'd suggest the best thing to do is you go on the City of Melbourne website and, all those, strategies are up there. So, we've had, junior scientists or citizen scientists, counting bats and counting birds and things like that, so that we can get an idea of, what is actually in the city and how we support it. And you will start to see, a greater number of tree species coming through, which then starts to support, some of the birds that we want back in the city. So it is a broader strategy than just planting trees. It's about the understory. It's about the diversity of the plants. And providing the habitat so that you can increase that rewilding.
That's very, very exciting, Rob. Thanks so much.
Okay. I'm going to leave you, if you don't mind, because I've got another engagement. And just thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking to you, and wish you all well with your course.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate your time. And thank you for your lovely talk. Really enjoyed it. And I'm going to share the presentation with all the students. And probably many of them will have questions for you. And I hope it's okay for them to reach out to you if they have any questions. But thank you once again.
Absolutely. And look, about 2 years ago, myself and 2 colleagues actually produced a bit of a book on this called Urban Choreography. I'm sure it'll be in the library there. and it tells that story. But there's a lot of material if you start going on to the website and start looking. If you use the right words like urban forest or rewilding, stuff like that, you'll get further material there as well. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob.
Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Bye.